G'day everyone and welcome to the Thomas More Center channel. My name's Mark Maciejewski and today it's my pleasure to be interviewing Dr. Brian Coman. Brian is a former research biologist who returned to the academy in his retirement to pursue a long-held interest in the humanities. For many years he was a regular contributor to Quadrant magazine and has written a number of books and articles. Brian, welcome to the show.
Yes, thanks Mark, and welcome everyone else.
So in order to, I suppose, let everyone know who you are, would you mind telling us a bit about your upbringing to get started, and then we'll go into your further career after that?
Yeah, I was born way back in 1944, so I'm giving my age away straight away, on a little farm, a soldier settlers farm near Kyneton in central Victoria. My father was a returned soldier from the First World War. He was wounded at Passchendaele and applied for a soldier settlers block, and so I spent my early years as a farmer boy, and our farm was overrun with rabbits, and that had a big influence on my subsequent career.
You worked as a research biologist for the Department of Natural Resources and Environment in Victoria. What kind of work were you involved in? You've already hinted at that.
Yeah, well, in those days it wasn't called that. It was called the Vermin and Noxious Weeds Destruction Board, a much more down-to-earth name, and dealt with the nitty-gritty of what we were doing. We were killing things, killing noxious animals, killing noxious plants. So obviously as a young farm boy I had ferrets, and my brother and I used to spend most of our spare time ferreting rabbits. So when the opportunity came up to get a job as a research officer doing the same thing, I couldn't believe my good fortune. So I worked with the department. They changed their name subsequently about every year, which is the way that government departments work these days. They've got to change their names every year or two. But I worked for them for about, I think it was 20, 25 years, somewhere like that, and then decided to go private. And I was still working in the general area of vertebrate pests. Did a lot of consultancy work both in Australia and overseas. And then I took early retirement. I had a car accident, not a serious one, but enough to not physically do much harm. But I decided it was time to give it away. And so I retired at about 55. And decided I'd go back to uni because I was always interested in the humanities. One of the things, of course, if you do a science degree, you don't get much of an opportunity to see the other side of the world. Well, you didn't back those days. So I went back as a mature age student, very mature age student, and I was fortunate enough to enter a course here at the La Trobe University in Bendigo. Called Studies in Western Traditions, which was a marvellous course, sadly no longer available. But there, for the first time in my life, I learned something about ancient Greece, about Homer and Plato. I'd missed all this as a young bloke. So that, again, had a big influence on the writing that I then did, obviously. So, yes, I've had a big change in outlook, you might say, over the years, from being sort of a scientific outlook to, I guess, a much broader philosophical outlook.
Yeah, and so you also had an interest in Alasdair MacIntyre, which we'll get into shortly, but just taking us back a little bit, you wrote a book called Tooth and Nail, which is basically a general history on the rabbit in Australia. And I was wondering, could you tell us the circumstances of its introduction and what made it such a bad pest?
Yeah, well, rabbits really have been pests since Roman times. People don't realise that the history of rabbit, or a lot of people don't realise that the history of rabbits as pests goes back probably 2,000 years or more. The rabbit originally was a native of Spain, and in fact some people maintain that Hispania, the Latin name, derives ultimately from the word rabbit. It was the Phoenicians sailing down the coast, they saw these little animals running around the cliffs along the Iberian coast, and they gave the place a particular name, Il Shapanim, I think it is in Hebrew or whatever, and it translates as Iberia or something like modern-day Spain. That's what I've been told. But at any rate, what happened was the Romans were very fond of rabbit. They particularly liked rabbit fetuses to eat. And so they transported rabbits all over the place. They transported them to England. They transported them to the Balearic Islands, all over the place, wherever they went, basically. And they got so, even in Roman times, they got so bad in the Balearic Islands that the inhabitants petitioned the emperor to send the army across to do something about it. But I don't think they succeeded. I think the rabbits are still there. But in any case, so the rabbits were introduced into England probably around about 11th, 12th century, I think it was, somewhere around about then. And then, of course, they came to Australia. When the European settlers came, they pined for the sorts of things they had back home. They didn't particularly like the Australian fauna. They didn't stay around long enough to be shot. It didn't present much of a sporting opportunity. So they introduced all sorts of things, foxes, rabbits, hares, as we all know. So we got a whole host of things. The rabbits came out in 1851, the first successful lot of rabbits. There were imports before then which were not successful, but the first successful import was in 1851, and that was in Thomas Austin in Victoria. And of course, eventually they broke out from his little compound, and they ran amok, expanded very rapidly, and went basically all over Australia, right up virtually almost to the tropics, certainly into arid Australia and into all the more fertile agricultural land in the south. And they were a huge, huge pest. And they still are in some places. But the advent of myxomatosis in the 1950s, and then later rabbit calicivirus, had an enormous impact. It hasn't killed them off completely, but it's quietened them down quite a bit. They still erupt from time to time. But basically, we're in a much better position now than what we were, say, 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah, you were saying, so the calicivirus, I have a memory of that in the mid-90s. Would that have been when it was released?
Yeah, I'm trying to cast my mind back. Yes, possibly a little earlier.
Because my memory is it was an island off South Australia, and there was talk of it being
introduced. My friend, I've got a colleague, Brian Cook, who was responsible, excuse me, for all the early work, and they were introduced to Wardang Island as a safety measure, so they, in case the virus wasn't specific. But the virus broke loose. They think that either mosquitoes or flies carried the virus to the mainland, and so it broke out unexpectedly amongst rabbits. And it was a very effective rabbit control agent, still is, though perhaps not as effective as it was, because resistance has built up somewhat. Natural resistance has built up in rabbit populations.
Yeah. So yeah, that's good to clarify, because I remember people speculating that it had been deliberately released, but if it's come off through mozzies or whatnot, that clears that up.
Well, it was. It was deliberately imported by CSIRO. Deliberately imported the virus, but it was not deliberately released from Wardang Island. That was an accident, but a most fortuitous accident. It was a bit of a...
For once, hey.
Some of the
history of fauna.
When it first broke out, and some of the farmers got to hear about it, they found out that all you needed to do really was to have a carcass of a rabbit somewhere that had died of calicivirus that you could bring to your property, and reproduce the disease. So the story went around how fathers and a lot of farmers were running over dead rabbits on the road or picking them up and taking them to their property. And the joke was, how far does calicivirus travel? And the answer was 10 k's on a dirt road, 100 k's on a seal road, because you go a lot faster on a seal road. So, and it also appeared in New Zealand under rather strange circumstances. No one knows how it got in. There's not too many questions being asked, I don't think. So obviously it was deliberately imported by someone into New Zealand, I'd imagine.
Yeah. So going back to your interest in Alasdair MacIntyre, his famous book After Virtue is concerned with the West's moves from absolute to relative standards, with virtues having been replaced by values.
Yes.
I was hoping you could expand upon this. Tell us why his book is so significant.
Right, perhaps we ought to backtrack a little bit so I can sort of introduce the way in which I came to MacIntyre. When I came to the humanities, when I first came to the humanities here in Bendigo, the philosophers that interested me most were those that either kept changing their minds or were unsure of themselves. And I was greatly attracted to them because I knew with people like that, you're getting the real thing. You get people that are not just there to exercise their brilliance as philosophers or try and carry out some sort of demolition job on some other philosopher. They are real searchers, and MacIntyre was a real searcher. There are other philosophers I like, people like Lezsek Kowlakowski, another searcher, even Thomas Nagel, whom I might talk about later too. But let's talk about MacIntyre. Yeah, I first came across MacIntyre, of course, in his most famous book, After Virtue. And in that book, MacIntyre is really responsible, I think, for bringing what we call Aristotelian teleology back into focus. And what we mean by that is that every living thing or everything has in this world has some sort of proper end or purpose. Now that got thrown out during or before the scientific revolution. People like Bacon and later philosophers, Locke and so on, that sort of a notion, all these Greek ideas were thrown out. It was really an aftermath of the Reformation, that anything to do with scholasticism was sort of on the nose. So Aristotle got thrown out, lock, stock and barrel. Now, while it's true that MacIntyre was not the only person to help to reinstate Aristotle in the 20th century, he was one of the big players. There were others. I'm trying to think of my memory's starting to go, but there was a woman philosopher in England whose name will come to me soon. I can't remember at the moment. It'll come back to me. But her and a couple of others were also starting to take a great interest in Aristotle, particularly his moral philosophy, and that's what MacIntyre done. Now, the interesting thing about MacIntyre is he started off basically as, if not a Marxist, certainly someone very interested in Marx's work. And I can understand, I think, why. MacIntyre always had a social conscience. When he was a young bloke, I read somewhere at uni, he had to travel through some of the lower class, some of the poorer suburbs to reach the university, and he saw the raw end of life, what these people were enduring, and it stayed with him. And so in his general philosophy and in his moral philosophy, he was very much concerned with this question of justice, moral justice and so on. So he started reading, and he got interested in Aristotle and in Aristotle's ideas of proper ends for things and the virtues. So we called that approach virtue ethics. And so he developed this over a course of years, refining his thoughts and sometimes dropping some of his ideas and picking up new ones. One of the most famous examples was early on when he started teaching Aristotle at uni. He thought, oh, look, I might read a bit of Aquinas just so I can show students where he went wrong. So he started reading Aquinas in the Summa. Of course, what happened was that Thomas Aquinas showed him where he was wrong, and he was man enough to realise it, and they very soon thereafter became very interested in Aquinas, and ended up, of course, converting to Catholicism. But he wasn't a Catholic when he wrote. Well, I think he converted in the same year that After Virtue appeared. So its genesis was before he became a Catholic. I think he was possibly a Christian before then, but not particularly committed. Now, it's important to point out that although he's no longer, he's repudiated most of Marx, he hasn't repudiated all of Marx. And I think he's right. There are things he says in Marx's critique of capitalism and of the consumer society and so on that ring true. So he's not prepared to walk away from that just because the rest of Marx's ideology is dreadful. And this is the same. He's got exactly the same approach with Nietzsche. He says, well, of course, Nietzsche was a mad dog in many things. He's calling the Christian religion, the religion, the slave morality and all this sort of stuff. But there are Nietzsche's critique of people like, let's say, Hume, the moral philosophy of people like Hume or Kant. He says, well, look, it holds water. It's good. I'm not going to chuck it up. And I admire the man for that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's the Catholic way, isn't it? To take the best of what's out there. It doesn't matter so much the source, so long as it's true. Or at least seems true.
I can't remember which of the apostles said, examine everything, take hold of that which is true. And I guess that's what MacIntyre has tried to do through his life. Now, for those viewing, and particularly the younger ones, if you really want an introduction to MacIntyre, I suggest you don't go to After Virtue, it's his first book, but perhaps to what was almost his last book, and that is God, Philosophy in the Universities. And it's a marvellous book. It's easy to read. MacIntyre's got a bit of a problem. He doesn't use big words a lot, but his sentences are very long, and he's not a good writer, I have to say. And so he's difficult to follow. You find yourself having to go back and read some of the sentences, which are sometimes a paragraph long, in order to get the sense of what he's trying to say. But in God, Philosophy in the Universities, it's all very simply put out, and it's all the big questions that particularly undergraduates want to ask. And it's all there in MacIntyre. And so I would recommend that book to anyone who wants to sort of get a background on MacIntyre. Go to that first, then go to After Virtue.
Okay, that's some good advice, true, because everyone wants to go to the famous work first, but if they haven't had the primer, it might be hard to break into. So you were saying that MacIntyre, he takes on relativism and addresses this replacement of virtues with values. I was wondering, could you speak some more to that?
Yes, well, what he's saying in After Virtue, it begins famously with a reference to a science fiction story. I haven't got my memory starting to go at my age, but in this science fiction story, it's one of these post-apocalyptic dystopian novels where in a world after some sort of a nuclear disaster, everything scientific is vanished. All the books of science are burned, all the instruments are smashed up, because people have blamed science for what's happened to them. And so what happens then is that in a later, a little bit more enlightened age, they're trying then to reconstruct what they have just broken up. So they got little bits of science, perhaps a little bit of some biological text, a little bit of Darwin perhaps, a little bit of atomic theory, but it's all disconnected. They're only little bits, half pages here and half pages there, and half constructed instruments and so on. And from this, they concoct a sort of a worldview and live by that, or try to live by that worldview. And this is exactly what's happened to moral philosophy, according to MacIntyre. What we have got, what we are living with, are the remnants. We are trying to put together the remnants of a philosophy that was destroyed in this, as the aftermath of the Reformation, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries, was destroyed. And they're just trying to, perhaps unwittingly, put it back together. So, as you say, virtues have been replaced by values. And MacIntyre's big problem with the whole moral philosophy seen today is that the various factions, rights theorists versus utilitarians versus Kantians and so on and so forth, they can't really speak to each other because they've got no common premise. They're all beginning from different premises. So MacIntyre, and I think he's quite right, he said, well, how can they ever expect to come to some agreement because their starting points are all the same? And his big point there is that you cannot have, you must, all moral philosophy, in fact, all philosophy is tradition bound. So you cannot have it outside of a tradition. Now, he's not thereby ruling out ruling that everyone has to abide by the Western tradition. Obviously, there are other great traditions in the East, but he's not. His concern is with the Western tradition, and he's saying, well, once you step outside that tradition, you've got no, as it were, no metaphysical starting point, no metaphysical ground on which to start. I mean, every decision you make eventually has got to be tracked back to some initial metaphysical assumption. We like to think that we talk about scientific fact in capitals as if you don't have to go any further than that it's self-explanatory. But of course, as he says, science can't lift itself up by its own bootstraps, as it were. It itself has to have some explanatory basis. We've often heard that saying that it's an act of faith to believe in the validity of your own reasoning. That's the sort of thing we're talking about. And this is the starting point for MacIntyre here.
And did he say that there was a way back, or is it more or less that moral philosophy was destroyed? It's been pieced together. What's the way forward?
Well, I guess he left it open. He wasn't particularly optimistic. He ends famously. I'm trying to recall the actual words in the last paragraph of his great work. He harkens back to Saint Benedict of Nursia, who, of course, founded the great monastic order. What happened was, after the dissolution of the Roman Empire, or after its decay, a lot of the early Christians went out into the desert fathers, as we all know. And it was Benedict of Nursia, particularly, that got the group of monks together and founded the monastic tradition from which Europe arose, and indeed the entire Western tradition. So what MacIntyre says in his last paragraph, we need another Saint Benedict, albeit a very different one. So we're looking for a way forward, and there are a lot of younger philosophers, younger students who have read MacIntyre and have been enthused by him, who have gone on to what we call, post-liberalism. So they're both post-liberal and pre-conservative at the same time. one of MacIntyre's problems with conservatism is he said, well, you know, the conservatism we talk about today is Burkean. I mean, it only dates back to Edmund Burke. So he said there are only liberals. He said there are conservative liberals, there are liberal liberals, there are socialist liberals, there are anarchic liberals, but they're all liberals. And he said we've got to somehow either break away from this to get to a true conservative tradition, because what we've got at the moment, and the secular liberal tradition, won't cut the mustard. Yeah.
Would you say that liberalism is almost breaking down before our eyes? Is that your take on things when you look around?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, you've only got to look at the events of the last few years in that great bastion of liberalism in America. America was the founding fathers relied on the great liberal tradition from Locke and Co. So that they were very much in the Enlightenment tradition, which pushed religion to the edges. Of course, it was a secular tradition, and we're seeing, as it were, the chickens come home to roost. That liberalism, without some sort of a metaphysical religious base, is in real trouble because, as lots of people have pointed out, it's got no sort of. I'm trying to think of the right word. It's got no hard and fast conception of truth. It's true. It's relative. It's relative because of basically because of individualism. Everything now has got a relativistic turn, and so truth itself has become relative, and that, of course, is a recipe for disaster, as we've seen. And it's not just. I mean, I've just recently. Just to finish off there, Mark, I've just recently reviewed a book called Deaths of Despair, and written by an American, and a very prominent American whose name I can't remember, but Nobel Prize winner, who points out that people don't realise the tremendous problem in America with deaths of despair and just despair in general, and drug overdose and alcoholism, and I mean we're seeing it in Australia too. So even though liberalism of the sort that we've got may be able to give us a good life in sort of material terms, it's a spiritual desert, and that's where people are running into trouble. That's quite obvious to anyone who looks.
Yeah, you've got the interesting contradiction of, would you call it late liberalism, where there's a very autocratic, kind of dogmatic streak that comes through now from what you'd, I guess, call kind of, not traditional liberals, but more modern ones.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, what do you make of
I command you to be liberal or else. I command you to be liberal or else. That's something like that. So, of course, the people that are copping it in the neck are the people of traditional faiths, particularly, of course, Catholicism. Traditional Catholicism is copping it. We all know that. I mean, it doesn't have to be stated. It's quite obvious. And that's, a direct product of that they cannot tolerate a sort of religion that can voice itself in the public square. It's just not allowed. So that's the dilemma we live in. Now, there are people, I'm trying to think of the guy who wrote the Benedict option.
Rod Dreher.
Rod Dreher. Now, one of the suggestions from Rod Dreher is that we sort of set up more or less an underground movement, I guess you'd call it, a little bit like they did in some of the Eastern Bloc countries during the Soviet era. where things had to be done basically in secret or on the quiet, or so we've almost reached that stage. And I think Dreyer, from memory, it's a long time since I read his book, but he says we've got to establish our own little communities, our own little sort of communities of defiance, if you like, circulate our own underground literature.
Parallel institutions as well.
Parallel institutions, that's the word I was looking for, parallel institutions.
Yeah.
So that was great. And I mean, a lot of people have taken that up. I haven't sort of followed it in more recent years, but there are very active. I might mention one very active group. There's a group of mainly younger philosophers and scholars from the Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio, who have put out a magazine, post-liberal magazine called New Polity, and they are very active in pushing the sorts of line. They're not. They rarely mention MacIntyre, but it's quite obvious that they've been sometime earlier on in their careers. They've probably been influenced by MacIntyre. So they're writing in this vein, and one of the most famous books to appear from one of them was Freedom from Morality. So that's what the modern liberal order is thinking it can do. It's thinking it has freedom from reality. But, of course, at the end of the day, the chickens come home to roost, and you cannot have freedom from morality. So that is a book. You can post it on your notes. You'll be able to find the author, whose name won't come to me at the moment. He's very well known. It's a book well worth reading. Quite difficult, I must say, but still well worth reading. Yeah.
There's something else that you mentioned in one of your books. I think it's related to MacIntyre, about utopian philosophies, and basically they ignore the fundamental flaw of humanity, which is we're fallen and can't be perfected in this world, and they're always trying to force perfection. Would you say that that's their fundamental flaw, is just a complete misreading of correct human anthropology?
Well, of course it is. But I mean, you've only got to. Whenever there's some sort of a social problem, let us say that kids beating each other up on the streets or whatever it is, the answer always is more education. What we need is more education. That will solve the problem. Or more of this or more of that.
More money for education. Not even.
Yeah.
Let's not even fix education, but spend more on it.
The theory is, look, that if people were only better educated, they would know better than to do these silly things. So, yeah, you're quite right. I mean, the idea of original sin, which is anathema, it's anathema to them, the idea of original sin. I mean, the perfectibility, they go on and say, oh, no, we don't believe in the perfectibility of man. But, of course, they do. They do in some sense. Of course they do. And if they can't do it normally, they'll do it by inserting microchips into us, like our made in America.
I thought the easiest way would just be knock those off, knock people off who aren't going to conform, and reduce the population to 3.
We might get to that too. That's one way of reaching their supposed utopia. But so yeah, there's an inability to understand the basic problem that we are crooked built. I can't remember who it was who used the term crooked timber, the crooked timber of humanity. He wasn't a Christian philosopher, I don't think, either. But even Plato realised this. I mean, it was pretty obvious to everyone that we're a lot less than perfect, and we're not going to get perfect. Probably not in this life, at any rate. So yeah, that's basically been thrown aside, and so it's led to all these sort of pathologies social pathologies that we've got at the moment, and the inability to address the core issue, which is that we are fallible creatures. Yeah.
Yeah. So changing tack a little. To Darwin's theory of evolution, rather, from revolution to evolution. You've said it's unfalsifiable in such that it's not entirely scientific Could you therefore say that a belief in evolution, or at least in single cell evolution, I suppose, is more akin to faith?
Yeah, I know what you're getting at, Mark. I've got no problems with general evolutionary theory. I mean, evolutionary biology. I mean, I was a biologist myself, obviously, and there's no question that things like natural. I mean, we've only got to think about having to have a new flu shot every year. We know that viruses and bacteria can undergo selection, and so things like that. Those parts of evolutionary theory are fine. There's no problem with them at all. Where the problem arises is where evolution is put up as the grand narrative to explain what they call a theory of everything, to explain everything, to explain the origins of all life, of human purpose, of the whole deal. That's where we run into problems. As far as normal everyday biology goes, and as I said, I was a working biologist. I've got lots of friends who were in evolutionary biology, but no problems whatsoever. And I think most Christian scientists haven't either. It's just that when you get people like Dawkins and so on, who want to then go that one step further and say, well, everything is explicable in scientific terms. And that's where people like Thomas Nagel, I've got a great admiration. I don't know if Thomas Nagel, I think he's still alive, he'd be well in his 90s now. But if your viewers haven't read Thomas Nagel, he's a good read. Now, Nagel's not a Christian, he's not a believer. He's in a strange position. I wouldn't call him an agnostic, and I wouldn't call him an atheist. He's in a sort of a grey area, but I like the man because he's very honest with himself. And he got very interested in in Dawkins' sort of evolutionary model. And he came to the conclusion as a philosopher that it just didn't cut the ice, that there were an enormous problem. I mean, I don't want to try and elongate this discussion too much, but just think, for instance, of Dawkins and the evolution of things like DNA. Now, in order to have evolution, you have to have DNA. You can't have partial DNA or sort of rudimentary DNA. You've got to have DNA because you've got to have some way of transporting information from one generation to the next. So DNA had to be there right at the beginning. So how did it get there? So what Dawkins says is, look, I know it's a slim chance, but in the primeval soup, all these molecules sort of came together and bingo, we had a DNA molecule. And people have pointed out, well, okay, we've looked at the probability of that, and the probability of that is less than the total numbers of atoms in the known universe multiplied by the known time of the universe. It's just not possible. But then Dawkins says, but you haven't considered the possibility of millions of other worlds. In fact, an infinity of other worlds. In an infinity of other worlds, the possibility then comes down. So he's got to go to these extraordinary lengths whose, in order to believe those, I mean, it takes an order of magnitude above religious belief to believe in something like that. So that's that's what concerns Nagel, and I quite agree with him. And poor old Nagel, he's struggling himself. He said, it seems to me that there's some sort of directedness in matter itself that I can't explain, but we may never be able to explain it. But that's the only way he can sort of get to it. So he's sort of teetering on the edge there, but I like the man because he was one of the few that when a few people started writing articles about the impossibility of the evolution of DNA, they were canned as being, fundamentalist Christians. and rat bags and so on. And Nagel came to their defence, which I thought was big of him. He wasn't a Christian himself. So, look, there are lots of other problems with that sort of extreme view of evolutionary theory, which tries to put the theory up as a theory of everything. That is, a theory of why we are here as human beings.
Yeah, one final question, which would be, so having been in academia and you'd have obviously a concern for you've been paying attention to new polity and the young philosophers coming up. What would you recommend to young, scholarly minded and academically minded young people in terms of navigating the university system? Should they bother navigating it? Should they, we were talking before, parallel institutions, go and set up a YouTube channel or something along those lines? What do you think's the best route forward for young people with this interest?
It's a difficult question to answer, because certainly in my day, when I was young, I mean, university education did get you, a good job, usually a permanent job, and a good salary and so on. I'm not sure that's still the case. There are lots of university graduates walking the streets looking for work. Universities of degrees, I think, have devalued somewhat. I'm always reminded of Victor Borger and his inflationary language. Universities have sort of inflated their value such that once upon a time it was sufficient to have a degree to get into certain sorts of jobs. Now you need at least a PhD, and before long you'll need more than that. I certainly don't think that unless you've got a specific career in mind, unless you've got something specific you want to do, I certainly wouldn't say that you need to go to a university. There are many. My own son went into the woodworking trade, cabinet making trade, and has had set up his own business, had a marvellous success, and made enough money to raise a family. So you don't be thinking that you've got to have that piece of paper. It doesn't mean what it used to mean, for starters. The whole system of university education is, in my view, has been somewhat devalued. It used to be the case also that you could go to university to get what we called a rounded education. So you'd go there and you'd learn not just a bit about whatever you're doing, but say medicine or geology or whatever, but maybe, a bit of philosophy and some of the humanities subjects. Well, of course, philosophy is now almost extinct in even the Australian Catholic University. I noticed recently has sort of downgraded their philosophy department. I read somewhere. So philosophy no longer in the pride of place. I mean, if it were the case that philosophy was still the number one sort of place at the university, then I would say to young people, if you're looking to try and find some meaning in life, by all means, go to the university and do philosophy and do some of the humanities. But sadly, that's not the case now. I was very fortunate when I came back to university and was about around about 2000, I think it was. There was still a course up here called Studies in Western Tradition, and it was marvellous. I mean, we were introduced to all the great philosophers, starting with Plato, and we were introduced to Homer. I'd never read Homer. I'd never read Plato. And, it really set me up to do a lot of the writing that I've done since then. It was a marvellous thing. So if you hunt around, you may find places somewhere or other where you can do this, where you can go and study the traditional subjects, particularly philosophy. And if you're philosophically minded, go for it. Yeah.
Speaking for our Australian audience, the one bright spark, or one of the few, is Campion College in Sydney.
Yes,
We did philosophy, theology, literature, and history. So there's your rounded education with electives in mathematics and Greek
yeah,
and Latin. So
yeah,
for anyone who is watching that is searching for that education, there is at least this one spot
yeah.
where
Well,
you
the
can get
other
that.
advice is, if you're sort of interested in that area, go and read MacIntyre's God, Philosophy and the Universities. It's an easy read. You won't find it difficult. That will give you a solid grounding on what it's all about. And then perhaps you might read people like Etienne Gilson's accounts of medieval philosophy. That will also give you a solid grounding on the whole philosophical tradition arising from ancient Greece right through, and its destruction during the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment. So they're the places to go, I think, to help you make up your mind what you'd like to do. Yeah.
Yeah. And finally, Brian, if you'd like to promote your own books, whereabouts can people find them?
Well, look, I've got a colleague of mine, Harry Olmeadow, who was the professor of religious studies here at La Trobe. Harry and I put together a bit of a website called Carburetor Press. So if you just type in Carburetor Press, all one word, you'll lob on our site. I'm not very proficient at building websites, so it's a little bit crude, but you'll see there are a number of books you can download. Some of them dealing with philosophy and religion, some not. Harry's got some good stuff in there on philosophy and religion. Harry's much more interested in the general area of religion, not specifically Christian, although he's a Christian himself. So have a look at that if you wish. And we've got some localised sort of books on dealing with the Coman River and the Campaspe River, the two rivers near where I was born. And I've just put a book out with another friend, an ornithologist, on the birds of the Bendigo district, which is perhaps of more local interest, but there's some good photographs in it. But anyway, I'd like to...
And just on that note, because you first came to my attention through an essay you wrote for a quadrant called Bird Law, and I thought it was a really lovely piece, and I've recommended it to other people. So if you want a short piece of Brian's work, I highly recommend Bird Law, and you can find that for free just by Googling it. So, Brian, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate you speaking with me, and I look forward to reading what you come up with next. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks everyone else.